This is your second big announcement of the year, second resignation, some might say. You stepped down as First Minister officially in May, but as of today, you're stepping back from Scottish frontline politics.
Frontline politics altogether.
What is it like to feud with the world's richest man? And how worried are you that he's going to be in a position of a lot of power in the Trump administration?
He's typical of these people who demand free speech and then are one of the first to attempt to shut it down when it's views that he does not like. Elon Musk, I said at the time, was one of the most dangerous men on the planet. Look, I don't want to leave Scotland, but ultimately if I take my former First Minister hat off and put on the most important hat, which is that of a father, can I say my children will be safe in this country? Absolutely, for simply being who they are. And I don't think I can definitively say yes to that.
Do you believe this government, the UK government, the Labour government of Sir Keir Starmer and David Lammy and others, do you believe this government is complicit in Israel's genocide in Gaza?
Yes, in short. How can they not be?
Last year, Humza Yousaf made history in the UK after he was elected as the First Minister of Scotland, becoming the first Muslim, in fact, to lead a Western country. Earlier this year, however, his term was cut short after he resigned as First Minister with the collapse of his coalition government. Today, Humza Yousaf is offering a second resignation of sorts, announcing that he will no longer be standing for the Scottish Parliament. He won't stand at the next elections in 2026, thereby ending an almost decade-and-a-half-long career in Scottish frontline politics. To make the news official, in an exclusive interview with Zeteo, I'm joined by the man himself, former Scottish First Minister, SNP politician, Humza Yousaf. Thanks for joining us on Zeteo.
Pleasure to be here.
So, this is your second big announcement of the year, second resignation, some might say. You stepped down as First Minister officially in May, but as of today, you are saying that you will not stand for the Scottish Parliament elections in 2026. You're stepping back from Scottish frontline politics.
Frontline politics altogether. Look, come 2026, I will have been an elected member for 15 years. And I think the time is right for me to step down, step away from frontline politics and look, make way for the next generation of elected members, but also try to use my experience, that decade and a half where I've been for 12 years of those 15 years, I will have been a government minister, different various roles. And I think I've got a lot to contribute, things that I've learned of what to do, things that I've learned of what not to do, and hope to be able to use some of that experience to make a good contribution on the global stage. To
be clear, when you say you're standing aside for others, I think you're 39 years old. You're not exactly that old yourself right now.
I'm not, but look, as I say, I will have been 15 years come 2026. And that is a good amount of time to be in frontline politics. I've achieved, I'm pleased to say, a lot. I hope being able to make a good contribution in Scottish and UK politics. But I think the time for me come 2026 to step away will be the right time for me and my family.
You formally resigned as First Minister in May when the Scottish Greens were planning to oust you after you terminated a power-sharing agreement between your party and their party, a partnership that you had promised to continue when you ran for First Minister. You then portrayed the fallout as a, quote, natural conclusion. But a lot of your critics say you just ditched the Greens before they could ditch you. Are they wrong?
The Greens probably would have rejected the Butte House Agreement. Their membership was probably going to do that. But things became really difficult in my party too, to be frank, after a pretty challenging interview for the Green co-leader on an issue of trans healthcare. There was people in my own party who were very supportive of the Butte House Agreement, now demanding that it was terminated. And look, me sacrificing my leadership and terminating that agreement, to me was still the right thing to have done. My successor is no longer encumbered with that deal, can make decisions and policy that he wants to take forward in our country's interest without having to negotiate and compromise with the Greens, but you can do that on an issue by issue basis.
You say issue by issue basis. What about the argument that you just weren't committed to the environmental and progressive agenda that the Greens are committed to, that the Green Party collapse was actually, the coalition collapse was triggered after your government dropped Scotland's historic climate goal? Green MSP Patrick Harvey said the rest of the environmental policies would be, quote, watered down, delayed or ditched altogether by the SNP. Was he onto something where the Greens right to be sceptical of the SNP's commitment to this?
Look, I disagree entirely. The legal commitment we had was always overly ambitious, to the point where the independent Climate Change Committee told us that the interim targets we had were just not achievable. So we had this legal statutory target we were never going to be able to meet. and therefore we had to find another route, which still shows ambition. Scotland still seen by many countries in the world as doing very well in terms of not just cutting carbon emissions, but
it's not just
leadership.
carbon. You've dropped a
on
bunch
the
of progressive
green
policies to do
agenda.
with free school meals, rail fares, a bunch of things have been dropped.
Well, first of all, look, we've got John Swinney, the current First Minister, has brought forward a budget. He's got to work within that budget. We have some issues that we're able to progress forward given the settlement from the UK government. But remember, we had 14 years of Tory austerity. Yes. The budget that we have is almost entirely dependent on the money that comes from London. We have some tax varying powers, and I introduced some progressive taxation that meant that those who earn the most pay more. But look, we're always, unfortunately, not being independent, going to be reliant on a budget from London. So no, we're still a very progressive party, a party that's very proudly rooted on the centre-left, both in domestic matters and international.
This past summer, your party had the worst performance in the British parliamentary election since 2010, with the Scottish Labour Party claiming the majority of Scottish seats. Why do you think the Scottish people abandoned your party in their droves? And what role did your resignation play? Did your predecessor Nicola Sturgeon's resignation last year play in that debacle?
Look, I think anybody who's been senior in the SNP, like I have, I'm government minister for 12 years, led the party for just over a year, of course I have to take an element of responsibility. It'd be foolish of me not to take an element of responsibility. But ultimately, that election was on the back of a national wave of support for Labour, not because I think of Labour's policies or principles, but because it was just an anti-Tory vote. People wanted to get rid of the Tories, and the message of voting Labour, even in Scotland, to get rid of the Tories is quite a powerful motivator. What's fascinating is a few months on, a poll just in the Sunday Times last week showed that the SNP had not just increased their lead over Labour Party, but stormed ahead. And if there was a Scottish Parliament election tomorrow, according to that poll, then the SNP and John Swinney, no doubt, would be returned to Butte House.
I thought politicians like yourself say the only poll that matters is on election.
Of course it does. Of course it does.
Well, let's talk about...
But any politician that tells you they don't watch polls is a politician.
That's true too. Look, one of the big rallying calls around the SNP since 2014 has been securing another referendum on independence for Scotland. You lost the last one narrowly. But now you've got no chance of having one. Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister, says there won't be a referendum. Earlier this year, just a little before your resignation from government, you said to James O'Brien, quote, "What I have to do is create the political conditions by which we get that second referendum." You failed on that, did you not?
It's probably the biggest regret I have in my political career is not convincing people in Scotland enough to vote for independence in 2014 and not winning that referendum. Because if we had won that referendum, we probably wouldn't have been dragged out of Europe against our will. We would not have had things like the disastrous implications of Liz Truss's budget. We would not be tied to UK foreign policy, which I think has been disastrous in reference to Gaza, as well as other issues as well. So it's one of the biggest regrets, probably the biggest regret I have in my political career, that we couldn't convince the Scottish people to vote for independence.
And that you didn't create the conditions for a second referendum, which was one of your
goals. And we haven't created the conditions yet, and that is the point I would make. There's no quick fire shortcut to getting independence, I'm afraid, particularly if you are like the SNP and we believe absolutely in a legal framework for another referendum, no wildcat referendum, no UDI, but of course a legal route. But what you've got is an impasse between the Scottish Government and UK Government, and one of the things I've called for is, look, how do we respect the democratic mandate of Scotland? And I think there should be some outreach to maybe even international mediators. How do you mediate between the UK Government and Scottish Government to break through that impasse? Because if this is a voluntary union, how on earth does Scotland leave?
In the US right now, there's this whole debate going on about whether the Democrats lost the presidential election and the congressional elections because of quote-unquote identity politics. Interestingly enough, that's what a lot of people have said about the SNP, that support for your party went down after you backed a Green Party bill that would have made it easier for people to change their legal gender, a bill that you campaigned on. Do you regret at all supporting that bill? Do you think quote-unquote identity politics, especially the gender identity debate, cost your party seats and cost you your career?
Well, look, you're asking two separate questions. One is the issue of so-called identity politics. Look, if people didn't stand up for minorities, then my life in this country would be far more difficult, as would a lot of other minorities. So I believe very much in backing minority rights. I don't believe that my rights exist in a vacuum. We all have rights, or none of us are going to enjoy those rights. So I don't apologise for a minute for backing people, minorities, including our trans community. When it comes to the issue of quote-unquote identity politics, there is something about how we try to remove some of the toxicity in this debate, because we should be able to say, I think quite uncontroversially, when it comes to trans healthcare, those who are trans and want to access healthcare, gender identity healthcare, they shouldn't have to wait years and years for that healthcare. When it comes to the process of getting a gender recognition certificate, how do you make it less dehumanising and how do you demedicalise it to a point? That shouldn't be a controversial statement to make, but because of the toxicity around this debate, it's become incredibly difficult. So I think we've got to work collectively across parties to try to remove some toxicity. Oh, of course you would. I mean, the way we approach the debate, perhaps, how did we take people with us alongside us in this debate, is not just a question for the SNP, although we have to answer it as those in the Scottish Government. How do we all collectively across the world ensure that every issue we bring forward that has to do with minorities and minorities' rights doesn't become a culture war issue?
So some would say that you contributed to the culture war issue. In April, you and your party expanded the controversial hate crime and public order bill to include protections for other marginalised groups, including the LGBTQ community. You got a lot of heat for this, including from author J.K. Rowling, who called the law, quote, ludicrous, after the then Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross suggested it could put people like J.K. Rowling at risk of arrest for anti-trans statements. Rishi Sunak's Conservative administration called it a chilling effect on speech. Do you believe any of those arguments were valid at all? And what do you say to people who say that trying to brand these hate crime laws as a protection of minorities, actually it's a form of censorship?
No. Well, first of all, of course they're not valid, because J.K. Rowling rightly hasn't been arrested. Neither would she be arrested, because under the law she has not met the criminal threshold, which is extremely high. When I look at the hate crime bill, for which I'm actually really proud of, I have, let's take my example, I have protection under the law from people stirring up hatred against me because of my race. I've had that for decades. Why should that not be extended to people because of their faith, because of their sexual orientation, because of the fact they might have a disability, and so on and so forth? Well, they should have the exact same rights that I have because of my race. And the criminal threshold in that legislation is purposely high. It has in that legislation protections for free speech as well. And it goes back to my point, Mehdi. We have to be able to have a conversation about advancing people's rights, advancing equality, as we all should be trying to do and striving to do, without it becoming a culture war issue. And this is the worry about, frankly, the rise of populism, the rise of far-right populism we see in the UK, Europe, the West, and much of the world.
During all of that debate, you were actually accused of violating your own hate crime law when a clip of you from 2020 as a Justice Minister resurfaced, in which you criticised Scotland's government for not having enough diversity, pointing out that the majority senior government officials in Scotland at that time were white.
We have to accept the reality and the evidence in front of us that Scotland has a problem of structural racism. When the most senior positions in Scotland are filled almost exclusively by those who are white. Take my portfolio alone. The Lord President, white. The Lord Justice Clerk, white. Every High Court judge, white. The Lord Advocate, white. The Solicitor General, white.
Of course, far-right trolls took that clip out of context and accused you of discriminating against white people. What is your reaction to that looking back?
I find it astonishing that those people who claim to be the champions of free speech demand that I get thrown into jail, get persecuted and prosecuted for stating out what is the very obvious, that far too many of our senior positions are not filled with people who are diverse or from our diverse communities. That is a statement of fact in the UK and in Scotland. I'm pleased that's beginning to change, but I do think that people who are often the champions of free speech or claim to be the champions of free speech are usually the first to complain when the speech is not to their liking.
You've been subjected to a lot of hate speech to do with your religion and your race over the years. Last year, you started as First Minister in the middle of Ramadan. During your first night in Boot House, the First Minister's residence, you led your family in the congregational Islamic evening prayer after breaking the fast together. And a lot of people celebrated that, but a lot of people got really mad about that online.
Yeah, again, those people who demand free speech, demand that their rights are protected, suddenly wanted my rights taken away from me.
How did you and your family feel at the time? You're celebrating this big achievement for yourself. And then...
Look, my family are well used to the fact that for years and years I've had abuse, trolling, threats, rape threats against my wife, death threats against my children. So we're unfortunately somewhat desensitized to it. But I put that picture out for one really simple reason, that it should be really normal that we have somebody who occupies the highest office in of the land that is Muslim, or that is Hindu in Rishi Sunak's case. Or that is black in the case of Vaughan Gethings, who was First Minister briefly in Wales. That should just be normal and normalised. And so, no, I was really proud of that moment, proud of the many firsts that I've achieved in life. But as I say, hopefully open the door for other generations of diverse communities to come through the ranks in politics.
So there have been these achievements for diverse communities, you mentioned some, but at the same time as Britain has been progressing in terms of a Hindu Prime Minister and a Muslim First Minister, you also had these horrific race riots this summer in parts of the UK, which many believe were spurred in part by far-right conspiracy theorists and extremists like Tommy Robinson, founder of the EDL, the English Defence League. You tried to hold him and his group accountable by calling on the UK Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, from the Labour Party, to formally classify his group as a terrorist organisation, which they haven't done yet. What is the case for doing that, and why do you think Labour haven't done it?
So I can't answer why Labour haven't done it. You'd have to get a Labour politician on here to ask why. I think they're probably scared of the reaction that they'll get. They know that some of those who associate with Tommy Robinson might well peel off to other political parties like Reform, who are seen as major challengers in the next general
Do you think Labour don't take Islamophobia seriously enough? There was that argument made during the summer that ministers...
They certainly don't take Islamophobia seriously enough. That's pretty clear, I think, from a range of actions. But when it comes to the race riots that we saw in Southport, not only were they amplified by Tommy Robinson, they were, of course, amplified by people who have sympathies with the far right and white supremacy, like Elon Musk, with his hundreds of millions of followers. And what you have is an undercurrent, but what was an undercurrent of institutional Islamophobia and societal Islamophobia then come to the surface. And I'm afraid what we're seeing across Europe, the UK and the West, is a rise in far-right populism that is almost entirely driven by anti-Muslim hatred, whether it's the National Front in France, the AfD in Germany, the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, and, of course, Reform here in the United Kingdom.
You mentioned Elon Musk. You got into that Twitter spat with him. You accused him, like you did just now, of amplifying far-right extremists. He called you a racist, accused you of, quote, loathing white people, referencing the clip we played a moment ago. At one point, your team even threatened to take legal action against Musk. What is it like to feud with the world's richest man? And how worried are you that he's going to be in a position of a lot of power in the Trump administration in a few weeks' time?
Well, again, he's typical of these people who demand free speech and then are one of the first to attempt to shut it down when it's views that he does not like. Elon Musk, I said at the time, was one of the most dangerous men on the planet. What has happened since November, the US elections, has made me absolutely sure of that statement of fact. The fact that he now is reportedly seeking to donate to Reform and give them £100 million war chest should ring alarm bells right up and down the United Kingdom. And nobody who doesn't live here should be able to buy elections as easily as Elon Musk.
What makes him dangerous? Is it his political views? What is it about his views?
A few things that make Elon Musk dangerous. First of all, the fact that he is not accountable to anybody except perhaps a few shareholders, but is able to buy extraordinary influence in the office of arguably the most powerful man in the entire world. He is apparently sitting in the interviews for chief of staff, for secretaries of state,
it's on phone calls
and living in Mar-a-Lago. Yeah, and if he is trying to emulate that influence in the next UK general election, that should, as I say, ring alarm bells right up and down the country.
Do you think he contributed to the race riots in the summer?
I don't doubt it for a minute. Of course he did. He amplified disinformation, which, by the way, a 10-second Google search would have told you that information was not true and was inaccurate. What he chose to do was purposely amplify it, and that undoubtedly lit the fuse for some of the race riots that we saw in Southport in the summer.
After those riots, you said, and I quote, "I don't know whether the future for me and my wife and my 3 children is going to be here in Scotland or the United Kingdom or indeed in Europe and the West because of the rise of Islamophobia." A pretty damning statement coming from any public figure, let alone someone who was a Muslim elected to the highest office in Scotland. Do you really see yourself one day leaving the UK, even Europe, or was that a moment of emotion?
Look, first of all, let me be clear, I wouldn't ever want to leave Scotland. I love Scotland. I'm born and bred in Scotland, passionate about my country, the country I had the pleasure of leading as First Minister. My girls are all being raised and educated in Scotland. But if you ask any Muslim up and down the United Kingdom, do they think their family will be safe in the UK, practicing their faith, being who they are, identifying as Muslim, then I haven't found a single Muslim who believes that their family would 100% be safe in this country. That is conversations, multiple conversations I've had with families and friends, and I worry about the future for my girls. So look, I don't want to leave Scotland, but ultimately if I take my former First Minister hat off and put on the most important hat, which is that of a father, can I say my children will be safe in this country? Absolutely, for simply being who they are. And I don't think I can definitively say yes to that. And that's what worries me.
It's a pretty shocking statement when you stop to think about it. If someone of your achievement who's got as far as you've gotten in public life is saying you're worried about your kids in this future.
Absolutely. And that's why people, I hope, would take it seriously. It's not a moment of emotion. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with making necessarily emotional statements. But it's actually a very rational, calculated statement to say that actually the direction that this country is going on is worrying millions of Muslims right up and down this country.
Has it got worse since October the 7th?
Undoubtedly got worse since October the 7th.
Last year, when Israel began their post-October 7th assault on Gaza, your father and mother-in-law were actually trapped in Gaza for 4 weeks, I believe. Despite that, you were one of the few Western leaders brave enough to actually call for a ceasefire early on and criticize Israel's military actions. What was that like for you to go through that, the terror that your family must have gone through, that your wife in particular must have gone through? And were you worried that, because you were also condemning what Hamas did on October the 7th, were you worried that doing that might jeopardize the safety of your in-laws?
When we saw what was happening on October the 7th and the videos and WhatsApp messages started to come through from my mother-in-law who was in Derbala in Gaza, my wife and I had to speak to her and effectively get her understanding to a point, her blessing, to be able to be as vocal and forceful as I was going to be in terms of the atrocious terror attack on October the 7th, knowing full well that if I did that, then there could be reprisal for her family, which ultimately could lead to some pretty devastating consequences for her parents. And in fairness to my wife, she gave me her absolute support. But the reason why I also called for a ceasefire days after October the 7th, and became, by the way, the first leader of a European government to call for that ceasefire. You'll remember at that point, leaders were going out of their way not to say the word ceasefire.
Yes. Justin Trudeau started saying it and then stopped himself.
Well, I think he said it and then went backwards on it. And others were just blatantly saying there should not be a ceasefire.
Including Keir Starmer.
Yeah, including Keir Starmer. The reason why I did it was because anybody who follows these events and has done over many years knew that the retaliation from Israel would go far beyond a legitimate response, as we have seen since October the 7th.
Your in-laws were eventually, thankfully, able to get out and come back to the UK, but I believe your brother-in-law, who's a doctor in Gaza, he and his family, are they still there?
They're out now.
They're out of Gaza.
But you're right, he was a paediatric surgeon, and the things he saw were beyond horrific. We still have some family. My wife's cousin, her 4 children, and other family are still there, and it's just a daily, waiting for that daily phone call to see if they've survived the night or not.
Do you believe this government, the UK government, the Labour government of Sir Keir Starmer and David Lammy and others, do you believe this government is complicit in Israel's genocide in Gaza?
Yes, in short. How can they not be? We have in Israel a government that has killed at least 45,000 people, at least, and I suspect the number is far higher than that. A UN verified study tells us that almost 70% of those killed are women and children. We have seen the bombing of schools, hospitals and refugee camps. 96% of Gaza's water is undrinkable. The person that leads that government has an ICC arrest warrant out for them for war crimes and crimes against humanity. There is an open ICJ investigation on the question of whether the crime of genocide has been committed. And yet, astonishingly, this government, the UK government, is sending weapons, arms and components for F-35 jets. So there's no doubt in my mind at all they are complicit. And I hope I hope and pray that I live to see the day that all of those who are complicit are held accountable for these crimes.
We shall see. One last foreign policy topic before we wrap up. You are the son of Pakistani immigrants, so I have to ask, how worried are you about the Pakistani government's continued imprisonment of former Prime Minister Imran Khan, who even just recently was indicted again for dubious charges alongside his wife? What is your reaction to what the Pakistani government is doing to him, to protesters, members of his party?
Look, I'm deeply disturbed. In a recent address at the Oxford Union, I made the point that this continual cycle of jailing your political opponents during an election fundamentally undermines your claims to be a democratic nation. And this is not just about the current case of Imran Khan. Of course, it has happened time and time again in the past. So I would make an appeal to the government of Pakistan, as somebody who doesn't affiliate with any political party in Pakistan. Look, live up to the words of Jinnah, Quaid-e-Azam, the founder of Pakistan. Let's make sure that Pakistan is a country where differing views can be heard, differing views can be respected, and that we stop this cycle of continually jailing political opponents every time there is an election.
Let's see if they listen to you and to others. Last question then. You're very passionate on some of these international issues. What does Humza Yousaf do next? Do you envisage yourself in the world of international affairs, international institutions, diplomacy? What do? You're 39 years old.
What I do next is, for the first time in my life, I will go to my daughter's Christmas show and be spend a bit more time as a father, which has been a wonderful thing, I have to say, since I stood down as First Minister. What I do next? Look, I would love to contribute to particularly conflict resolution across the world and peacemaking, because there is far too much conflict in our world and it seems to only be getting worse. And I'm also very passionate, as we've discussed, about tackling the far right and the rise of populism in the UK, Europe and the West. So look, I'll take some time. We've got a bit of time before the next Scottish elections, 2026. But it certainly won't stop me, I have to say, from speaking out on the issues that I'm very passionate about, both at home and abroad.
I do have one more last question, which I like to ask people.
This is your third. This is your third last question.
I know, it's one of those ones. I just keep going. You were First Minister for a year. You came to office with a lot of potential. You're a young politician. You broke records as the first Muslim to lead a Western democracy, and then it kind of ended in tears. As a politician, ending a political career in Scotland, what is your biggest regret?
Look, regrets, achievements, mistakes, I've got all three. And you can sit there and reflect over regrets all day and every day. As I mentioned previously, my probably biggest regret politically is not convincing the people of Scotland, or not convincing enough people in Scotland, that their best future is one as an independent nation. That would have stopped the folly of Brexit, would have meant that we wouldn't have had the impact or direct impact of Liz Truss's terrible budget, and we wouldn't be so anchored to UK foreign policy, which I think in the Middle East in particular has been disastrous. So look, that's one thing I'll keep campaigning for, even though I won't be a frontline politician come 2026. I'll still be campaigning strongly for that Scotland becomes an independent country, and suspect I'll see it sooner rather than later.
We shall see. Humza Yousaf, thanks so much for speaking with Zeteo. Appreciate it.
A pleasure.
Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to zeteo.com. Your support matters.